Hello you! In this video I'm going to be responding to a nonsense video by notable propaganda outlet PragerU, explaining why and where this guy's wrong, and fact-checking his numbers, one of which is backed up by a source.
Did you know that according to a Johns Hopkins study, that same year medical errors killed 250,000 people?
So if that doesn't sound like fun, I don't blame you. It's a pretty niche topic, but I'll be throwing in some jokes and any references or points I make will be on screen to stop you from falling asleep. So if you're still here, let's have a quick overview before we begin. The video I'm responding to is called Cops Are the Good Guys, which they are, don't leave. But even though he's right about the police being good, the video still has a large amount of lies and misinformation.
I call them Black Lives Matter because it's based on the falsehood that police represent a danger to black people.
I've linked his video as well as all of my sources in the description, so check it out if you'd like an easier time following along. It's only 2.5 minutes if you speed it up. So briefly, PragerU is set up by evangelical right-wingers to combat left-leaning education, and after watching their nonsense videos that are 5 minutes long and take $25,000 each to make, I can confirm that they are anti-education. That budget of over $10 million is always on display. Look how each word drops down in time with what he's saying. I wish I had that kind of editing. So let's talk about this video in particular. Sheriff David Clarke argues that the left, made up of
self-righteous politicians and activists,
is demonizing the police. Tempting as it is to make this video 3 minutes long by just asking for any evidence at all,
cops are ordinary human beings, like everyone else. Lawyers, surgeons, and baseball players, they make mistakes. But no profession works harder to correct its mistakes.
Why don't you prove it?
I've set myself the task of going through it point by point and providing my own evidence for my conclusions, so please feel free to disagree or fact-check me. I'm not going to go through the long list of sources on the PragerU website for the video, mainly because it would take forever and because I already quickly checked them all. I found that 15 out of the 30 came from either the Heritage Foundation or Reason.com, so I really don't feel the need to debunk 20-odd articles from websites ranging from credible right-leaning news to a right-wing organization financed by Republican billionaires. 3 were links to other PragerU videos, and 1 was to his own book on the subject, which... come on. Of the 11 good sources, 3 are just police reports from common outlets like the Huffington Post, and 1 was a poll that shows that respect for the police is at an all-time high, which really damages his point later on. So I'll be responding to what he says in the video, especially considering I have good reason to suspect that the source list is incorrect. If you'd like to skip ahead to the part where I catch him lying, really obviously, you can skip to the time on screen. Go ahead, do it. It's not like it put ever in the first half anyway. For those of you good children who are still here, let's begin with a quick point that he doesn't even try to justify that I just gave you earlier.
Lawyers, surgeons, and baseball players make mistakes, but no profession works harder to correct its mistakes.
This is the first part of the video that implicitly misrepresents the problem that Black Lives Matter have with the police, subtly suggesting that the problem activists have is a high level of mistakes, and we'll come back to this in more detail later, but suffice to say, I don't think he's done no research at all, or that he doesn't know what he's talking about. So I don't know why he's claiming that protests happen because of mistakes, and not the racial disparity in shootings. But you might be of the opinion that there isn't any racial differences in police shootings or violence, or that it's small enough to not warrant protests. I'll also come back to this section later, trust me.
Believe me.
Believe me.
Believe me.
Believe me.
But for this specific point, I couldn't find any data on how the baseball industry works to improve its mistakes, and he doesn't give any measurements by which to judge how improvements are made, so fact-checking this is pretty hard. But luckily, it's not my responsibility to justify it. It also doesn't seem to be his, since in his list of sources there's no mention of this at all. He has 4 sources supporting the fact that the police are good, but none about this claim, which I think is pretty telling. But this is the guy who gives his own book as a credible source of information, so I don't know what I expected. Well, I refuse to put in more effort than he did, so I'm going to move on.
Like everything else this crowd does, they've got it all backwards. The police aren't the problem. The politicians and activists are. The police didn't create the failed urban policies that have locked people into generational poverty. The police aren't responsible for fatherless homes, failing schools, and bad lifestyle choices.
Sorry, had to speed that up for pacing reasons. So he's saying that the police deal with the fallout from problems that these politicians create. He can't possibly mean that Black Lives Matter or activists got those policies enacted. I'm not going to discuss generational poverty or failing schools in black neighborhoods to keep this video on topic. They could fuel their own depressing video on their own. But I'd recommend a ContraPoints video that's quite relevant. So those are real problems, but talking about the nebulous concept of bad lifestyle choices is a subtle way of saying that black people are just more likely to be criminals, so they just deserve what they get. Fatherless homes is a pretty common talking point, and it's not totally unfounded. Kansas Obama referenced it in the 2008 speech, and CDC numbers suggest that the number is around 40%, which is terrible, but it's not the 70% claimed by one sheriff that did the rounds. It's a problem that hurts a child's educational prospects and their likelihood of committing a crime, but it's not a major problem facing black people in America to be considered alongside things like the racial wealth gap, higher unemployment, and the problems left over from a history of racism. But I want to end this segment on a point of agreement. We both agree that self-serving politicians do cause and foster these policies.
And they sure as hell aren't responsible for the lack of respect shown to police officers. It is this lack of respect for authority, fostered over decades by the progressive left and its fear the police narrative, that has led to the needless deaths of so many young black men.
In all of his 30 sources, none of them back this up, which is a really weird omission. Even stranger is that one of the sources is a poll showing a near record high in respect for the police. So what, is the left just not good at fostering fear? It's a really weird, counterintuitive thing to include, but I'll address it anyway. The left fosters fear and lack of respect. That's not a part of the Democratic Party or the Green Party's message, so he probably means that Black Lives Matter erodes trust in the police. Well, it's a pretty reasonable claim, actually. I mean, if there are mass protests against anything, it's usually for a good reason. So let's take a look at the claim. Trust in the police did dip in 2015 when the movement was gaining traction, but it's back to average now, despite the same motivation causing football players to kneel, which the president regularly tweets about, so it must have been the protests then. I absolutely think that a lack of trust in the police is a terrible thing, but protesting injustices is how we get improvements in the police and results in a better overall level of trust. For example, the Ferguson incident kickstarted the use of police body cameras, which I don't imagine would have been the case if the killing wasn't part of a trend that a large activist group was highlighting. It's worth noting that evidence into body cameras is somewhat contradictory. For example, this study says that police received 93% less complaints with them equipped, and this one says that they make no difference in confidence or number of complaints. I'm obviously on the side of body cameras, as are the majority of the American people, because whether they deter bad policing or not, I think that having oversight and using them as evidence in trials is unambiguously just worth the cost. Either way, they were implemented thanks in part to the national pressure Black Lives Matter caused for more accountancy, so the confidence in police didn't noticeably change and a good policy was implemented. So does Black Lives Matter erode trust in the police? With hindsight, it's clear that it was a temporary change, which seems to be corrected after the police took action, despite the public attention not dying down much. So yeah, kind of, but I'd say it was worth it. Now, let's move on to the really problematic part of the video.
It is this lack of respect for authority, fostered over decades by the progressive left and its fear the police narrative, that has led to the needless deaths of so many young black men.
Now, that's a pretty bold claim, that lack of respect caused their deaths. I had a little bit of trouble talking about this, since there are a lot of high-profile victims receiving media coverage, and I don't want to be accused of strawmanning. But luckily, he provides a few examples, which I can only assume he chose because they're representative of his point. This is the section I used to entice you in earlier, because this is just so profoundly ignorant of the facts and disrespectful to the victims. Unfortunately for the good sheriff, though, these are quite possibly the worst examples to use if you happen to be arguing that racially charged killings are just innocent mistakes. The three examples given of black men resisting arrest are awfully interesting choices once you've read up on the details of the cases. I'm assuming that you might have heard these names on the news, which was the extent of my knowledge when I first watched the video, but knowing the details made me realize how deceitful he's being, considering the gruesome details of each case.
When officers in Baltimore told Freddie Gray to stop resisting arrest, did he comply?
No, but he was arrested for possession of a switchblade and was found an hour later with his spine 80% severed at the neck, in a coma.
When Officer Darren Wilson told Michael Brown to get out of the middle of the street in Ferguson, Missouri, did Brown comply?
No, he was unarmed and shot 7 times after stealing a box of cigars and running away.
When officers in New York City told Eric Garner to stop resisting arrest, did he comply?
No, he was killed on the scene from being placed in a chokehold and suffocated after being caught selling cigarettes. Now, I'm no animator, as you can tell if you haven't all tabbed out by now, but if I'm given the job of giving a few short shots to represent these incidents, calmly talking it over isn't how I would go about it. Or maybe the animator found footage of all 3 men neutrally talking to the police before they were battered or shot. Yes, these people shouldn't have been doing these things, but were they criminals? Maybe. We'll never know, since they were dead before they could be tried or charged. Did any of these men deserve to die as a result of disobeying the police? Assuming that you answered no into your monitor, then that means congratulations, you're in sympathy with that radical terrorist group whose evil objective is to have the police not use excessive force, wear body cameras, and not have the police
Police the police!
If you follow. Unfortunately, there's one more depressing section before the fun bit where we look at how comically bad his data is. Honestly, it does get more light and breezy after this. There's even an air horn sound effects later in, so you know it's fun. But first...
But the idea that a law-abiding citizen has to fear the police is a terrible and destructive lie.
Yeah, let's get this bit over with. In general, I do think that the police arrest the bad guys most of the time. It's hard to find numbers on it since most figures look at the conviction rate, and it would be pretty unfair to attribute this to the police force. But responding to the point, it isn't always guilty people that should fear the police, and since he doesn't give an example, all I need to do is just reference the infamous Tamir Rice incident, a 12-year-old black boy who was shot twice by a police officer for having a pellet gun. Yeah, the kid shouldn't have had a toy gun at 4 p.m. in a park, but on the other hand, he shouldn't have been fucking killed. Interestingly, while looking into this case, I found that the shooter was deemed to be too emotionally unstable and of the wrong temperament while wielding a weapon. The shooter was fired 3 years later for not volunteering this information, although blame also lies with the precinct for not checking his past. The other officer in the car had assaulted a woman who phoned the police about a parking violation, and she'd protested the officer's arresting of a suspect. The officer was later sued over this assault. So this caller was assaulted by the officer that she had phoned for protesting that officer's decision. Obviously, my point is that there are a few bad apples that sully the good name of the police, and that these people, who have a high amount of racial bias, that are so suspicious of minorities that you shoot a 12-year-old without being sure whether they're holding a firearm, it's these people that mean that his statement isn't true. But it's easier to bob for those bad apples if you're using body cameras or any significant oversight. Now let's move on to the good stuff.
In 2014, 990 people were killed in police use of force incidents. Does that sound like a lot? Did you know that according to a Johns Hopkins study, that same year medical errors killed 250,000 people, yet activists aren't marching in the streets demanding that the medical profession be reformed? Why not?
In my first draft of this section, I had a great time talking about the number of force of use? I had a great time talking about the number of force of use of force incidents. He doesn't reference it in the YouTube video or the description. It's tucked away on the PragerU website, which I only found after recording and editing this section.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
The source of the statistic is from a website that tracks police killings, which reported 1,114 dead in 2014, and it turns out to be quite reliable. It's well sourced, and it's been used in countless articles on both sides of the spectrum. But just because his source on the website checks out, it doesn't mean he's in the all clear. Just to get the obvious out of the way, people aren't writing against doctors because medical errors aren't racially distributed, as far as I can find. But also, if you've been paying attention, you might have picked up that there's something funny going on. In the video, Clarke says that
in 2014, 990 people were killed in police use of force incidents.
But that's not quite right. He's off by 124 deaths, based on his own source. That's weird. Why might that be? The video was posted in April of 2018, so it wasn't that information wasn't reported yet, and his source reports that the number is over 1,000 for that year. So what's going on? Why is he giving a different number than his source? And why give the number at 990? It seems oddly specific, almost as if he didn't get the number from the listed source. And for one final strange thing, is that in the list of sources, his quote is listed under more than 990 killed, which, yeah, I guess that 1,114 is greater than 990. Now, this might seem trivial, but it does lead to a pretty fun conclusion, so bear with me. I don't know how the production of PragerU videos go, but here's one version of events that solves all of these inconsistencies, so join me and put on your tinfoil caps. Clarke, as I did, looked up the numbers for police use of force and found this article by the Foundation for Economic Education. He found that this chart, which gives a number of 990, the lowest estimate compared to The Guardian, compared to another website that tracks police killings, and compared to his own source. So, using the lowest number he finds that's also credible, he includes it in his video. And then, in post, when he or when somebody else is putting together the sources, and also links to other PragerU videos, they twist what he said slightly, and put in another source that fits this new claim, that now he said over 990. The only mystery then becomes why he said 2014 instead of 2015, but maybe he was just lying for the sake of comparison to his Johns Hopkins paper in the same year.
That same year,
and counting on nobody finding the actual source for the number of 990, which would show that he's cherry-picking. That's what my guess would be, but maybe it was just an innocent mistake that his transcript and sources list said different things, and maybe he just chose to include 990 out of thin air. Who's to say, really? Just through a lot of information and numbers at you, so I'll quickly summarise. As I said earlier, which source he used and quoted and didn't use and whatever, it doesn't really matter, since his overall point is stupid comparing police shootings to medical errors. But I did want to highlight it, A, because I wanted to brag about finding a mistake, but mainly B, because it shows a real disdain for facts. It would have been much easier for him to say around 1,000 people were killed, but he went the extra mile to cherry pick and distort data, and then cover it up. So just to recap, ignoring the numbers. He cherry-picked data. He then used this and presented X. In the source list, it claims that he said Y, and his source claims Z. So even the process of choosing correct data is seriously flawed. So how can we be expected to take him seriously about things that he does cite?
Did you know that according to a Johns Hopkins study, that same year medical errors killed 250,000 people?
That's right, we're finally doing this one. The second study he mentions is pretty reliable. It's not surprising since he gives some indication of the source. So you might be thinking, well, how are you going to debunk a paper from Johns Hopkins? That's really well respected and prestigious. And I'm not. The paper is going to debunk him. Looking at this, obviously it doesn't help his point since, as I said earlier, making mistakes isn't the problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Well, that was easy. I guess I could leave it there, but that would be no fun. I mean, it is the only actual source he's given, so let's take a minute to kick him while he's down. So the point he's using the paper to make, that people should be outraged at doctors if they're angry at the police, isn't correct, since people are angry at the racial bias in police shootings and not racial bias in medical errors, which I'll finally address in the next section. So while we're here, what does it say? The study claims that the bulk of these deaths represent a problem with the system of healthcare in the US, blaming, amongst other things, fragmented insurance networks and the heavy limitation of safety nets. Oh. Word of advice, don't recommend studies in a right-wing propaganda video that are pro-universal healthcare. And not only that, but this study's authors published an open letter urging the problem of medical errors to be added to annual cause of death lists. So isn't that nice? He led me to find evidence of a profession
And works harder to correct its mistakes.
Oh, and also?
Yet activists aren't marching in the streets demanding that the medical profession be reformed.
If you've stuck around this long, it's probably because you agree with my opinion. But if you are someone who thinks that Black Lives Matter isn't necessary and that there's no police bias, this is the bit where I give the common sense facts. Now, in researching this video, I pretty quickly found a decent source with evidence showing statistics on police killings that backs me up, but I wanted to go ahead and preemptively disarm critics. So I went looking for dissenting studies on racial profiling and use of force that the right wing use. This led me to a Harvard study vetted by the right wing that a guest on Steven Crowder's show proudly referenced. It's in the abstract that the paper says that there's a huge racial disparity in violence, but not in shootings. I mean, this study isn't flawless. It was only in 3 states, and it looked at the outcome of police interactions after being stopped, without incorporating the fact that black people are more likely to be stopped, and for no reason. I won't go into it any further here, since it's not really relevant to the PragerU video, but you can read a highly detailed argument here. So here's the data that I found online without much difficulty. Numbers from the FBI indicate a serious racial bias in killings, both with or without resisting. So there is undeniably either a high rate of shootings or a high rate in use of force, depending on where you get your information from. This data is a little bit old, but here are some more recent numbers, compounding the point that black people are more likely to be killed by a huge margin. Now that I've given you the facts, we can take a look at this bit.
Black lives matter because it's based on the falsehood that police represent a danger to black people.
Bearing in mind the data we just went over, it's pretty fair to say that the police represent a greater danger to black people, you could say that, or police represent a danger to black criminals, or police represent a danger to criminals. I suppose you can't really pull impressive numbers with claims like that, actually.
Lawful aggressive policing is going down. Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute has explained why. She calls it the Ferguson effect, and it's real.
It's also common sense. Why police officers reason? Put your career at risk if 30 seconds of smartphone video taken out of context can destroy it.
Finally, a chance to talk about straight-up data. About time as well. So, the Ferguson effect is the idea that policing goes down because police are afraid to do their job, in case they're framed by footage of them doing something illegal. But if you're not doing anything wrong, then even out of context, footage of you doing your job correctly shouldn't be a problem, but alright. His point is that the Ferguson effect is real. Cool. If I was going to argue on his terms, I might say, Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General, has explained why. It's called the Ferguson effect, and it's not real. And leave it there, since we're both just quoting somebody. I mean, he's quoting a higher up at a conservative think tank, and I'm quoting the Attorney General. But that would be the level of discourse, and I'd be able to wrap up this video. Well, good thing I'm working from a study by the University of Missouri that urges people not to jump to conclusions, which I'll go over for good measure. There was a correlated uptick in property-related crimes a couple of months after the Ferguson incident, if that counts, and oh my god, the activists are rioting and looting, and this is the strongest evidence for the effect. But obviously isn't causation, and I doubt it's the kind of crime that Clarke means. I think he must be talking about violent crime or homicides, which is what he's showing a few black people doing in this animation. So let's not dwell on this slight increase in property crimes, and look at that instead. Numbers for both violent crime and homicides are well within normal levels, both on a micro and macro scale. So, And not only that, but it even calls out his source by name, going on to say that people who decry a normal fluctuation in crime, as the Ferguson effects, are unhelpful. And in case all of that wasn't enough for you, the study also says that the Ferguson effect isn't real, quite explicitly. I'm just about ready to wrap things up here, but I would like to credit David Clarke for not taking the easy Fox News route of showing this clip and concluding that it represents the whole movement. So well done, gold star. Although, of course, it is possible that he didn't find that clip, because, as we know, he's not very good at research. But there is a good way to stop clips being taken out of context, isn't there? It's not cheap, but I imagine that the goodwill and increased trust of the people would help cushion the blow. That and the $4.5 million in city lawsuits that would surely go down if trials concluded faster from conclusive evidence that might be presented. I couldn't think of a good way to end this, since I didn't really put forward any major points of my own in this. I just tried to dismantle his nonsense. I guess my point is that PragerU is propaganda, and not very good propaganda at that. Body cameras are good, and Black Lives Matter have legitimate grievances, which isn't really much to go on. But then I thought, why would I conclude when I can have David Clarke do it for me? So just remember, the idea put forth by the right that Black Lives Matter isn't needed, or that they are somehow the racist ones,
is a terrible and destructive lie. Those who try to convince you either out of ignorance or out of some ideological agenda, those are the people you should fear. Run from them, not the cops.
If you stuck around this long, thanks a lot for watching. It's my first video, so I'm sure the mic quality is rough and there are probably some sound issues I didn't find in post, so I appreciate it. I'm not planning on making any more unless this does really well or something. So leave some feedback if you like. It's probably no use subscribing, but wouldn't hurt. Yeah, bye.